Okay, so hopefully this has started recording. Hi there to anyone who ends up watching this. My name is Anthony. I used to coach KZN debating from 2021 and somewhat in 2022. I'm currently studying international and European law at the University of Groningen, and I'm going to be partly presenting this content session on Eastern Europe alongside a friend of mine, Joe.
Hi, people I don't know. I also wave now. My name is Joe. I'm from Romania, so I'm your Eastern European guide for today. I'm also studying international and European law. And yeah, I think that's everything about me. But I'll let you guys know a lot about Eastern Europe today. So yeah.
Yep, so thank you very much to Joe for helping me on this because I was asked to do a presentation on Eastern Europe and I thought it would be very bad for me as a person who's not from Eastern Europe to tell you everything about it. Luckily Joe knows a lot. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to split this up into four different sections. First of all, we're going to do just a general definition. So Joe's going to run you through a few maps on describing what is Eastern Europe because this is actually a rather diversified opinion. There's probably a few different ideas on what Eastern Europe actually is, and also this is based on how this has changed over time. We're then going to move on to introducing the USSR, giving some historical perspective, what happened during the USSR and the Iron Curtain, and how this has affected Eastern Europe as well. Thirdly, the post-fall of communism, how that happened, what that transition phase was like, and how that's affected Eastern Europe today. And then finally, we'll go over Ukraine, it being the most recent topic, so we'll cover it at the end. What we're also going to do is, throughout this, we don't have a specific section covering how to deal with all of these issues in debate, but as we go through this content session, we'll sort of run through if you encounter so-and-so topic in a debate, or if you want to run this idea in a debate, how would you go about doing it? So that's me for now. I will return in the next few minutes or so once Joe is done, but Joe is not going to deal with the definition part of Eastern Europe.
Okay, so the thing with Eastern Europe is that it depends who you're asking what is Eastern Europe. Because for example, if you ask from a very general perspective, everything that you see on this map, everything that you see in the eastern part of Europe could be considered Eastern Europe. However, if you would tell a Polish person that they are Eastern Europeans, they would probably get super upset. So the way I decided to analyze Eastern Europe is through different perspectives. From a political perspective, like a very general perspective, everything that you see on this map is the Eastern Bloc. All those countries have been affected by communism, obviously in different ways. Some have been under USSR, some have been independent but still communist states. Some, like the Balkans, have been in Yugoslavia. But generally speaking, Eastern Europe and everything that happened with communism in the second half of the 20th century can be applied to those countries. However, from a geographical and a cultural perspective, it's a bit more restrictive. That will really depend on the motion you will guys have. So the thing you have to keep in mind is that, yeah, Eastern Europe can be analyzed in a very general way, but what I'm gonna show you now through some different maps that I made, which were really fun to make, is that there's Eastern Europe can be divided in very different parts. So we can move on to the next map. So what you guys see in this map is all the countries that you've seen before split in what I would say geographical and cultural regions of, big Eastern Europe, let's say. Everything with red, which is Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania, is basically the pure Eastern Europe. Everything with green, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, is Central Europe. Everything with yellow is the Baltics, and the blue are the Balkans. Now, why is important to make this distinction? Because from a cultural perspective, they are very different from each other. If you move on to the next map, for example, it's in terms of religion, everything in red is Orthodox, everything in green is Catholic, and then we also have a bit of Lutheran and Muslim countries. Why is this important? Is because this really affects the culture of each state. Even though, let's say, Poland and Romania may be similar in the eyes of people who are, let's say, not from Europe, they have very distinct cultures, religions, traditions, and it's important to keep in mind that whenever we're talking about Eastern Europe, we should take into account mostly Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, Moldova, even Romania, though Romania is very diverse. I would say that Romania includes all of the colors so far, but we'll treat Romania as an Eastern European country. So just to sum it up, uh, pure Eastern European countries are the ones that are, Russia and Belarus and Moldova. Yeah, exactly, the ones with red. The rest of them, you should kind of treat them as separate, like Central European or the Balkans. But you also might encounter those countries under Eastern Europe or in like more general situations. I hope this was clear because Eastern Europe is, very complex, I would say.
We've also had the discussion that I think you did tell me at some point that Romania is a country, for example, like different parts of Romania might find themselves aligned with different cultures more so.
Yeah, like for example, I am from the north part of Romania, which is somehow in between Eastern Europe and Central Europe. So the east is more close to Russia. The west is more close to Hungary and Austria because of the Hungarian Empire occupation, and the south is very very volcanic in culture. So I would say that in like on this map, Romania is like the best example of kind of encountering all the little cultures from the eastern part of Europe. But yeah, that's it for the definition. Moving on to the next thing, which is actually kind of related to the political perspective that we were talking about, is USSR and the Iron Curtain, or the Eastern Bloc, because I've already mentioned a bit about it. So USSR is basically everything. Basically, USSR is Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, the Baltics, and the Caucasus and Central Asian countries that we don't see that well on this map. The rest of the pink countries that you see that are, however, delimited, you can see their borders with the white contour, are the countries that were under the Iron Curtain, which was basically a division between the West and the East between World War II and the Cold War. So basically, apart from USSR, it included Poland, Eastern Germany. There's the whole chat about the Berlin Wall, which we might mention a bit later in this training. Czechoslovakia, because those two countries were together at that point. Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Why is it important to keep in mind this distinction is that USSR was basically having their own thing, and the rest of the countries that were under the Iron Curtain were like puppet countries that, well, they were all communist and they were all kind of like the USSR had a really big influence on them. However, on paper, they were independent. So if we talk about the political consequences of communism in Eastern Europe, they are all applicable to all the countries that are with pink, but not all of them were under USSR. I think that's it for this part.
Okay, cool. Amazing. So then we head on to a little bit of background and context then on the formation of the USSR. I think what, as a starting point, is to go all the way back to before, like, we'll start at the Russian Revolution, basically. So that obviously was in 1917 with the overthrowing of the monarchy and the installation of the Bolsheviks, who were a political party at the time. There were also the Mensheviks, but the Bolsheviks are the one who pretty much got power in 1917. There was then a period between 1917 and 1922, which is when there were actual conversations about creating a union instead of just having like Russia and a number of other states. So obviously 1917 had the Bolsheviks taking over. What also happened at a similar time then was Bolshevist Soviet states. So what's important to understand here is that the Bolsheviks based a lot of their ideology on Marx's works, which some of you might be aware of. So Marxism was very prominent. And Marxism obviously has the focus on workers' liberation and workers' revolution. This means that the Bolsheviks were very much in favor of having the spread of this idea of workers' liberation throughout, not just Europe and Eastern Europe, but the entire world as a whole. So a lot of states that then sort of took their independence and had their own revolutions ended up sort of modeling themselves after the Bolsheviks. So you ended up with these Bolshevist Soviet states. Note that at this point in time, we didn't have the USSR. We didn't have this union yet, so they were all independent states, but they did find some similarity and connection with Russia. So examples of these states include Lithuania, Latvia, Ukraine, Hungary, Slovakia, etc. A final point here is that not all of these states necessarily became part of the USSR. So if I'm correct, Hungary never became part of the USSR, but they were still they would still call themselves a Soviet state. In a similar way, when China became communist, it sort of modeled itself or called itself originally a Soviet state. So the idea here really stemming from Lenin's ideology, Lenin being Vladimir Lenin, the head of the Bolsheviks, was the idea of spreading this revolution around the world. When it comes to the formation, then, this is sort of 1917 onwards, but really from 1922, there was a conversation about, how do we sort of unify Russia so that we don't just have, our Communist Party, but also Russia and all these independent republics in Eastern Europe and surrounding Russia. So this is where we have the introduction of our favorite person, Stalin, and obviously the political turmoil and struggle between the Communist Party in Russia and different figures like Lenin and Stalin. So an example of this is how they wanted to create this USSR. Stalin was very much in favor of creating the USSR. Lenin was also somewhat in favor, but they had different opinions on the structure of the Union. So for Lenin, he focused very much on independent Soviet states and therefore creating a sort of federation. This was important for him, obviously, because if these states weren't independent, then you wouldn't have the spread of workers' liberation. Also, when Russia was making deals following World War One, there was there were attempts at times, mainly by Stalin, to try and make deals on behalf of these other independent Soviet states. So Ukraine, for example, there were pacts that were signed by Berlin and Moscow to sort of engage in economic trade and cooperation, and Stalin tried to sign on behalf of these Soviet states. Obviously, states like Ukraine disagreed with this, and this didn't end up happening. And Lenin also attempted this a bit earlier as well. But the bottom line is Lenin actually agreed with states like Ukraine at a point, and he said, yeah, you know what, it makes sense that you want to be independent, and we should keep this. Stalin preferred this autonomization. In his eyes, he's like, well, if we want this pure, like, communist Soviet vision, we need a conglomeration of states. They can't be independent. Stalin sort of won at the end, in the sense that the union was achieved and his vision was created. But Lenin did win in sort of creating a federation, in that the structure of the union was that you had different federal states, but the power was centralized at the center of the union. So there was a central government and all of these things, but in terms of how federation somewhat works, each of these states did have some degree of autonomy in how they made decisions. But there was a centralized power in Russia, which was the center of the USSR. So the important takeaway from this is just obviously historical information for yourselves, but also to recognize that when we talk about the USSR, we're not just talking about Russia, and we also should keep in mind that there were a lot of states that, this wasn't a spread of communism necessarily from Russia. It did inspire a lot of Soviet states, but there were also a lot of states that wanted to remain independent. So it wasn't this sort of rolling initiative amongst all these countries in Eastern Europe to jump into the bandwagon of being part of the USSR. That wasn't necessarily the case. Obviously, then after 1924, Lenin dies. He's no longer the leader of the party. Stalin comes into power, and then we get Stalin's policies. I apologize that I didn't include the end bracket here after Stalinism. That is going to mess with my OCD for the rest of the slide, but apologies. So I'm going to address this first point of policies, and then Joe's going to tell us more about individuals' experiences during communist reign. We say communism here, in terms of this was communism in practice. This obviously isn't pure communist ideology or Marxism. Please don't treat it as such. And obviously in debates and stuff, whenever you get conversations about should we have communism, should we have workers' liberation, stuff like that, please don't like base this off of but Russia was bad and like the USSR sucked. I think there is a place to mention those things, and say that this is a problem, but to say that certain tenets of communism, Marxism, like workers' liberation and workers' rights, is something that is bad because the USSR was bad or Stalin's reign was bad isn't the same thing. And the reason we're going to cover policies is to look at Stalin's take on how he led the USSR and Stalinism, which is sort of its own style of leadership and ideology, and sort of how he interpreted communism. This is not to say that this is what communism actually is. So, the 5-year plans. You might know of these. Their 5-year plans are not only associated with Stalin, a lot of other Soviet states implemented them. A lot of countries nowadays have their own version of 5-year plans, which is basically visions on what needs to be achieved at the end of this period of time. So they started in 1928 and ended in 1990, right before the fall of communism. We'll get to that later on in the session. But the idea was mainly, we have these plans in place and we have goals that need to be met. So there were multiple 5-year plans. I think in total there were 11 or 12, I'm not really sure, but each one would put, let's say, an industrial goal or target for each industry, like energy goals, industrial goals, agricultural goals, etc. And these needed to be met. So different types of these. Collectivization was the first one and most prominent and well known, which was basically reforming the agricultural sector, where what happened was you had a lot of, were they Kuvaks? I think they were like basically the rich peasants in a way. Like these were people that owned farmland, etc. And there were also other and then there were like everyone else that was working on this land and farming on this land. Basically, Stalin didn't like this difference in power, not because of the pure communist vision of like everyone should be equal, but because he wanted power to be centralized. So his whole goal was to basically create collective farms, where he basically removed the richer peasantry sort of from power, and this was done by means of, harsh oppression, and throwing people into the gulags, which we'll deal with in a moment, which was an extremely terrible period of time. Basically making these collective farms and then setting targets, agricultural goals that needed to be met. If these goals were met, there were obviously rewards to be sent out, but if any areas were struggling in meeting their goals, there wasn't assistance provided, but harsher repercussions and oppression to sort of force individuals to meet these goals. This became problematic in a few instances, the most prominent one being the famine of 1932 to 33, where there was basically the agricultural sector plummeted, the goals weren't able to be met, and the response to this by Stalin and his government was to basically oppress more people, imprison more people, send them to prison camps, etc. And essentially a large portion of the Russian population starved during this time. So the goal was to sort of nationalize the agricultural sector. That's what collectivization was. As to how effective this policy was, there was an increase in agriculture at times, but when faced with things like famine, also during the Second World War, agricultural rates plummeted significantly. And what ended up happening was that most of the general populace ended up starving, which was terrible. On top of collectivization, there was general industrial progression. A similar thing happened here, where basically Russia, the USSR in total, set sort of industrial targets that needed to be met. Another thing I want to note here, because I'm saying Russia and USSR, is that these plans sort of started in Russia, and then as Stalin's power increased throughout time, which I'll get to in the next point, these plans sort of spread and these goals sort of spread. So his control and power spread to the point where he could start to influence and set these goals and targets in other states that were part of the USSR. But at the starting point, these were mostly centralized in Russia but spread. So when it came to industrial progression, how effective was it? I would say that for a period of time it was effective. So the USSR, in the first and second 5-year plans, for example, increased industrialization to the point where the USSR was second in industrialization behind the US. So there was certainly, merit to these goals and these targets that were being set. But as time increased, it became harder and harder for these goals to be reached. This had to do with political instability, also because, as we say, the main motivation behind reaching these goals were, basically oppression as a form of encouragement. So if you met as an individual worker in a factory, if you met your targets, you might get a little bit more food because food was rationed out because we're all part of the union. We all struggle together, and that was sort of the mantra, but said in a much better fashion. But eventually got to the point where if you weren't meeting your if you weren't meeting your targets, then food was being taken away from you. Your pay was being significantly cut. These were sort of measures that were implemented. So industrial progression, I would say, did increase in Russia, in the USSR, sorry, throughout the whole period of 1928 to 1990. It decreased over time, and obviously the USSR's industrialization did diminish over this period of time. So overall, did it increase? Yes. Was the way in which it was enforced good? Arguably, no. And did it increase to the point where, it was incredibly significant for the USSR towards the end of the reign of communism in Eastern Europe? No. And we'll deal with this later on, but to touch on it lightly, this is because when you have the fractioning and splintering of different states away from the USSR, obviously that group and collective industrialization sort of doesn't happen anymore. Moving on then to Stalin's main way of staying in power, propaganda and cult of personality. I've included here a picture from a children's book, which was actually a children's book illustrating the 5-year plans, right? This was a means of propaganda that Stalin used to sort of, make his plans and his policies very appealing. So yeah, things like children's books were produced. But in general, Stalin did two things. First of all, removal of political opposition. There were a lot of stage trials that took place, for example. So how Stalin eventually removed the Bolshevik Party from government to ensure that he stayed in power was to sort of accuse them of resistance or opposition to, the communist agenda. And there were these stage trials that took place where the fates of these individuals were, already destined. They were being sent to prison camps, but it was made to, put them as, being this form of resistance, these forms of, these individuals trying to revolt against communism. So this was one thing that he used to remove political opposition in a way that made him stand in a much, to make him stand as a more prominent, trustworthy individual, because look, he's removing all of those that are trying to harm us and hurt us. But what he also did was create this cult of personality. And we mention this because we see it as being a very prominent thing, not just in USSR, and not just in other autocratic, tyrannical regimes, but also I think throughout politics as a whole. And the cult of personality is a lot of things like propaganda being used to make your leader seem as some sort of godly figure in a way, or someone who is, more trustworthy, someone who is more intelligent, more capable than the average individual. This is someone who you'd put your trust in because they are the destined person who's going to lead your nation into prosperity. And I would say that we see this to lesser degrees even today. I would argue that the way that America, publicizes its politics does create some sort of cult of personality. The sort of like two-party system, the idea that we have sort of one delegate that represents the entirety of the Democrats, the entirety of the Republicans, but also the thing of like how much security we have around presidents, like how much they're made as being these extremely prominent individuals, is in its way a soft version of creating a cult of personality. Now, obviously, you can reach your own discussion as to how important something like that is, to have a figurehead that leads your nation, and that their security is something that is important, but it is interesting to see that these sort of hard tactics that Stalin was implementing are sort of still applicable today. Final thing of the gulags, which are these prison camps that were created. Keep in mind that these were implemented during Lenin's time. The Red Terror, for example, was the wiping out of all political opposition directly following the revolution and the creation of prison camps. Stalin made these obviously much, much larger, and hundreds of thousands of individuals ended up in these prison labor camps, and ended up dying. The idea of it was just to remove any person who was in opposition to Stalin's rule. These were, political opponents, but these were also farmers, ordinary citizens. It was basically to the point of, if you didn't do what you were told, you were ending up in these sort of labor camps, which was an incredibly horrible and traumatizing experience for hundreds of thousands of people. So this sort of I think bridges the gap quite nicely, because obviously when we talk about what these people were actually experiencing in something like a prison camp, we can also have a look at, well, what were people's general experiences under communist reign? And Joe will cover this next point.
Okay, so Anthony talked a lot about USSR. What I'm gonna do now, because I'm Romanian and my parents and grandparents experienced communism, so I know quite a lot about their experience in Romania. However, every communist country had similar experiences, so whether it's Bulgaria, Romania, or some other country from the USSR, the experiences were more or less similar. So there's a very big difference in like systems that are totalitarian between like the theory and the practice. Because, for example, in theory, communism and like the way it was created would, promote equality for everyone. Everyone would have equal chances. Everyone would have a job. They would, genuinely live a decent life. However, the reason why communism didn't succeed in Russia and in the rest of the communist countries, it was because in practice, it was really, really, really hard to happen. That is because when someone has a lot of power, it's very likely that they will abuse that power unless there are certain mechanisms that will, checks and balances, let's say. That didn't happen in communism. Technically was supposed to happen on paper. The separation of power on paper, it existed. However, people were named in certain positions, and you would have a dictator naming people in the, let's say, judicial system. So then, even if you would have a trial, it would always be in favor of the dictator, not in favor of the person or the people who are accused. Now, going back to the experience of people, I think what I'm going to do is I'm also going to tackle a bit the points that were mentioned previously. For example, Anthony mentioned the collectivization, the whole process. How that looked in practice is that people who owned land, because a lot of those countries in Eastern Europe are still today mainly rural than urban. So a lot of people had land, houses, they were farming. That was basically how people lived for centuries and centuries in Eastern Europe. What happened is that one day they woke up and their land was taken, and whatever they would produce on that land, it was not there anymore. It was the state, property, and, the state would manage all the resources. And this happened in a way in which they didn't receive any money in exchange for their land or any support. They only had to go through a lot of traumatic experiences where they literally lost everything, and any form of opposition to this would basically get them into a gulag or a prison, or, they would even be killed by all of a sudden, and there was not really a way in which you could protect yourself because there were no state authorities that you could appeal to, because everything was basically under the dictator power. Also, in terms of the propaganda and cult of personality, if you look, for example, at North Korea and you think that all those kids who are, indoctrinated, and they do all those dances and they say those poems for the dictators, you would think that that is a very utopic, surreal thing. It actually existed in communism. My parents, when they were 5 or 6, they had to be, dressed up in the whole communist outfit, and they had to go to certain representations and say their little poem about how our dictator is the best and how this is the best system we live in. And a lot of people were indoctrinated in this way. You would have pictures of the dictator of that certain country in classes. You would have classes dedicated for this. So the whole propaganda and cult of personality was a really, really big thing. And it was really, really hard to fight it. You could see some ways of, revolution at the end of the communist regimes when people started to fight. But again, if you would oppose the system, that would get you in a prison instantly. So it was really, really dangerous to even try to say something against the main power. Also, in terms of the way people lived, the whole idea that communist is like equal for everyone is the biggest lie when it comes to practice. That is because people who were in power lived comfortably. They were able to travel. They were able to receive food and a lot of resources. However, people who were not in power positions or who didn't have connections with the people in power, they barely had enough food for their children. It was really, really hard to get anything. You would have electricity from like, I don't know, 6 to 8 during the evening. It was really cold. It was really hard to get, like, for example, medical help if needed. There was also like impossible, let's say, to get an abortion as a woman. So the life was really, really hard during communism. And only the people who were in power or who had connections were able to actually have a good life. My grandparents, for example, they were teachers, and they were actually really lucky compared to other people, because since they were working like they were, state workers, to call them like this, because they were working in like public institutions, they were actually in a very good position. They didn't have to suffer. My grandpa actually had a car. That was a rarity for communist times, in which people barely had like resources to, live. So in terms of like, how people were living back then, I think this is pretty much the most important thing. One important thing that I would mention is that also communism started to look very different at the end of it. So like in the 80s, close to 90s. That is because every dictator kind of decided to have their own strategy for their country. Some of them decided to be a bit soft and like looked towards the West. Some didn't. In case of Romania, Romania became like super isolated from everything, because they started to really appreciate the North Korean system, and that was kind of the destination of Romania. Thankfully, we didn't get there, but I think I'm gonna tell more about this in the next part. But yeah, is there anything about the life that I might have missed? Oh yeah, religion. Amazing. Yeah, the thing about religion, because actually I will mention that in the next thing, but it's important to talk about religion now. So I remember the map that we showed you like a bit earlier. So basically, Eastern Europe is very well known in this world for us being very, very religious. For example, Poland is a very religious country. That's why you get all the abortion, LGBT controversies. Romania is very, very religious. We have a lot of churches. And that is basically because, as I said, we lived in mostly rural spaces where community, religion, church, all of them played an important role. So one thing about communism is that basically communism is an atheist, how do you call it? Ideology. Atheist ideology. During communism, religion was not really practiced. Churches were banned, closed, destroyed, everything, you name it. But people were still very religious. They practiced religions in secrecy and prayed not to get discovered, because otherwise they would be considered against the system. So during communism, people were still very religious in those countries. But, however, religion was not allowed. And it was, a thing that they just kept secret. I think this was, Okay. Oh, okay. Post-fall of communism. Still me, if I can still speak. So, after living in such bad conditions, people at some point woke up and they were like, no, we cannot live like this forever. Now, this happened in very different ways. 1989 is the year of revolutions, most of them happening during autumn. Most of them were peaceful. Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, they basically had peaceful revolutions. Their government decided, no, we're not going to be communist anymore. We want to just go as far away from Russia as possible, from the USSR as possible. However, we also have an exception, my dear Romania, in which we killed our dictator on Christmas Day. And I mean, joke aside, a lot of people died that day. It was a pretty sad day. However, since then we're communist free, so I guess that's good for us. We also had, because the first picture is actually from Berlin, because the eastern part of Germany and like half of the Berlin were under communist occupation. They also had a nice revolution, destroyed the wall, connected the two Germanys together. And yeah, surely after those countries had their own revolutions, also USSR got split back into its original countries. I think that was 1991, if I'm not mistaken. And basically, yeah, after that, it was no more USSR, no more communism. However, that didn't miraculously bring all those countries in a democratic state, which is what I'm gonna talk about now. So, recovering from communism is something that is still happening today. Communism is also one of the big reasons why Eastern Europe is in a more less developed state than Western European countries. What a lot of people like to say is that communism set us back, like, I don't know, 50 years, like behind the West. So basically, what happened when communism fell? People found themselves in with a lot of freedom. But if you experience communism for your entire life and you never actually experience democracy and freedom, when you're faced with it, it's really, really hard to manage. And this is something that I personally also experienced a bit in Romania, because I'm born in 2003, which is exactly after the fall of communism and during like the recovery of Eastern Europe from communism. So in terms of democracy and law, we did create like a democratic constitution right after our revolution. We had like elections and everything. However, it was not as democratic and as nice as we wanted to. And the reason for that is because the people who were in power were people who used to be communists. Because at that time, the older generations that used to be in power before communism, those people were mostly dead, because a lot of them were killed, or they were in prisons, or they were just dead because they were old. So everyone we had in power were people who grew up with communism, people who were indoctrinated with communism. So the first parties we had, our first free elections, were actually by Socialist Party, who claimed that they are democratic and that they respect all those human rights and that they aspire for a free market and everything that communism was not. However, what happened for the first, let's say, 10 years after the fall of communism in Romania, it was some sort of communism, but that was not called communism. It was not nice. We still carry the scars of communism exactly because those people didn't dramatically change the system. However, what we can also see is that the conservative mentality that is often it's found very often in Eastern Europe is also kind of a consequence of this, because communism used to be very conservative. They used to reject anything that was from the West, or anything that was, American or too progressive. And when communism fell and you had people who kind of kept communism going, we didn't really embrace all those progressive movements all of a sudden, and that is also why you can still see a lot of conservative movements in Eastern Europe. Like I said, in Poland with the abortions, or in Hungary, there's also a lot of issues. Another thing is the comeback of religion, because I mentioned how people were still religious during communism, although it was not accepted as a practice and they would do it in secrecy. Once communism fell, there was a big comeback of religion, because people in Eastern Europe, they've been religious for their whole life, so they were finally free to express that. Religion still plays an important role. However, thankfully, we're not like in the Middle Ages, where church was an important power in the state. We do have a separation of church and the state. However, people still have a conservative mentality. They still reject a lot of the things from the West. As I said, I feel and I think, and a lot of people think, that communism really set us 50 years behind the West, because it didn't allow us to experience all those progressive things that the West did, because we were still stuck in our communist bubble. Probably Eastern Europe in like 20 years will be the way it looks now in the West, but that obviously takes time. To be fair, I think that's all of the most important things about post-fall of communism. One link that I added here is a documentary about Romania's path towards democracy. It's 3 hours long, so if you actually watch it, I would be very, very proud of you, because it's a very nice documentary. But it's really cool because it shows exactly how we experienced this freedom and how we didn't just become like democratic all of a sudden, all of a sudden. And yeah, I think there's a lot of good things you can take from this documentary.
Okay, cool. So these next few slides, I think we'll go a lot more back and forth on. Like we're just going to sort of jump in at times, based on who knows the most, because we sort of have our individual interests here. So the other thing I want to look at, we want to look at, sorry, is sort of like at an international level how these post-communist states sort of interacted. My starting point here is the Warsaw Pact, which is interesting because this basically had to do with sort of like, it was basically a defensive pact that was made as sort of a counter to NATO. So before we talk about Eastern European states sort of joining NATO, there was like Berlin Wall times, Iron Curtain times, the Warsaw Pact, and NATO. So there were, pretty much after the fall of communism, there was also the introduction of satellite states. So we have Russia, now just Russia, and it still had some states under its control, or states that sort of wanted to follow communism, which is like what Joe was alluding to in the previous slide, that sort of even though communism officially fell, then you had sort of your socialist, four democratic states, but like they weren't necessarily so. So the Warsaw Pact didn't have a lot of nations in it. It was quite small compared to NATO, but you had a point in time where Russia was aligned with a number of satellite states that were sort of more favorable, or sort of had more favor towards Russia, whereas a lot of NATO states were more Western inclined. So this is our starting point. But then we head over to the ascension to NATO and the European Union. So we have quite a lot of Eastern European states that have now joined NATO, and this number continues. And in terms of how we've seen this affect NATO, I would say most prominently has been with the whole Russian-Ukraine invasion, in the sense that the key factor I've pointed out is a massive increase in, well, not massive, but I would say for these states a substantial increase in defensive spending. So Poland, for example, plans on increasing its defensive spending to 4% in the next few years. And you'd say, well, 4% isn't that much, but for a small country like Poland, it is a considerable amount. There have been some instances where people have said that pretty much NATO's, has become incredibly reliant on a lot of these Eastern European countries in these past, 5 years or so, especially with Russia, Ukraine, because this has been the entirety of NATO's control in Eastern Europe, their control over, the Black Sea, their movement of supply, of trade and supplies, for example, into Ukraine, etc., is very much dependent on these Eastern European states. So what we have seen now is a sort of movement away from Russia and away from like more communist inclined countries, or who present themselves as following communist ideology, and towards more Western liberal states. Obviously the other reason for this is there's a lot of advantages for these Eastern European countries to do so. This is not to say that these countries that do so, that join NATO, are vanguards of human rights or like the most democratic countries, but definitely they're making a movement towards it, although at the same time keep in mind there are defensive and economic benefits to joining these NATO countries. I would say if you were to characterize these states, I wouldn't call them necessarily like the greatest, but I would say that it's a very, very good thing that's happening, and these are probably your more favorable Eastern European states. This doesn't necessarily directly link to ascension to the European Union. I would say that there is some connection, but you probably know a little bit more about this part than I do. Go for it.
Okay, so in terms of the EU, right?
Yeah.
So in terms of the EU, if we look at the Eastern Bloc, Actually, the countries who obviously ascended first and who had like a better situation were the Central European countries like Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary. So they joined EDU, all good here. Then we have Romania and Bulgaria who joined the EU in 2007. They're still facing some issues in the sense that we were not accepted in Schengen. Hopefully we will at some point. The reason why they joined like a bit later and that they still face some issues is because of corruption, because of poverty level, because of other internal issues, because of migration. So this would be like the main reason why we didn't join Schengen yet. But yeah, we're in the EU, so that's cool for us. Then we have Moldova and Ukraine, who are candidate country, who are now like have been candidate countries for quite a long time, and now the European Commission has recommended member states to start the negotiations for them to join the EU. That is because Moldova has been doing a lot of, has improved a lot its situation from being a very Russian controlled little country to becoming more and more Western, having a very good political system right now, elections, everything. So Moldova is on a very good path. And Ukraine is also trying as much as possible to move towards the West, but I think we're going to talk about this more into the Ukraine section. One thing that I wanted to add in terms of the EU, because we talked about Ukraine, we talked about Romania, Moldova, Belarus, we hardly mention it because Belarus it's its own thing, its own bubble. They're the last like pure dictatorship in Europe, though Russia is also kind of a dictatorship, but Belarus is purely dictatorship. So they are just their own thing, and while Russia is a whole different discussion. They kind of lost their chance of joining the EU a long time ago, and now for sure they won't be able to do that. I don't think they want that anymore. But yeah, that's it for the EU.
Yeah, I think the final thing I'd want to mention here, and like you can obviously jump in, is like if you get motions that have to do with such and such Eastern European country joining the EU, right, in terms of should this country be allowed to join the EU, should it be blocked from joining the EU, how would you sort of frame those types of debates?
Well, if we're like basically the countries that would be the most important here would be Moldova and Ukraine. So I would focus on them. And then obviously if you would go for pro reasons for them joining the EU, apart from the fact that, you know, their rightful, you know, reason for being in EDU because they're in Europe and all that discussion, apart from that, you would probably mention all the improvements they made in their political system, their judicial system, economy, everything that they've done since now to become more and more Western. If you would talk about the reason not to join the EU, probably you would have to talk about territorial disputes, which is going to be tackled in Ukraine, but I will just give this small example from Moldova. The eastern part of Moldova contains a zone called Transnistria, which basically is a zone where there was Russian military that was there under USSR, and basically they just never left. And Transnistria is kind of its own thing. Like you actually cross a border from Moldova to there. Nobody recognizes Transnistria, probably apart from Russia. So if you would mention the reasons for why countries shouldn't join the EU, one important criteria is not to have territorial disputes, which is not necessarily the case for Ukraine and Moldova, since both of them actually have active territorial disputes, and it's quite complicated. For example, Romania and Bulgaria, they didn't have those territorial disputes, so I think that was a very good advantage for us for actually joining the EU.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, like, I would also add to that the fact that, well, like, first of all, obviously the reason for like territorial disputes not being allowed is if you want to accede to the EU, you obviously have to follow the EU's values and show that you're capable of following their fundamental values. For example, free movement. So this is why you can't have territorial disputes. So keep in mind that if you're ever talking about acceding to the EU, even if this isn't the topic here, always keep in mind what their central values are. Furthermore, I think there was something else I wanted to say. Oh yeah, can you cover the distinction between? Oh wait, no, it's fine. Basically, that there is also the distinction between Schengen area, Eurozone, and the European Union. They all do different things. You might have already received training on this. Schengen is more so the borderless area. Eurozone is more a financial union, so all of those countries use the euro, for example. We know that the European Union is its own customs union, political union, things like that. So obviously, it would be cool for certain Eastern European countries to be part of the Schengen area, and they obviously have to be Schengen before they would be EU, because if they can prove to be part of Schengen area, they can prove to be borderless, and then they can prove to go up to the European Union, things like that. So keep in mind that there is a distinction between these different types of areas. There's a process that needs to be followed, but also a conversation of a country joining the European Union is slightly different to the conversation of a country joining a Schengen area, would be my final point of distinction. And then, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to give an example for you guys to have it more clear. For example, Switzerland is not part of the EU, but Switzerland is part of Schengen. Ireland is part of the EU, but is not part of Schengen. The reason is because it's an island, and they kind of need those, checks at the border.
Yeah.
But yeah, basically, you can have countries that are in the EU but not in Schengen, and vice versa. You should just check a map so you know for sure which is where.
Yeah. So you could argue that generally speaking, it would be nice to be in Schengen to be part of EU, but it's not like. In terms of certain situations, it's not an absolute requirement. You don't have to be part of Schengen to be part of the EU.
Yeah, firstly you join the EU, and then
exactly.
The next step is Schengen.
Yeah, 100%. Cool, so I'm going to deal with everything outside of Europe then, namely China, right? NATO is sort of our discussion of relationships between Eastern European countries and the US. I would say, generally speaking, there are some Eastern European countries, those moving away from China, who are choosing to pursue agreements with the US. A big factor that is sort of the big fight currently between the United States and China when it comes to getting Eastern European countries on their sides is trying to make energy agreements. So, for example, with the current energy crisis in Europe, it's appealing to have a country like the China or the US who is offering, energy in exchange for other things. So these are, the deals that are being formulated between superpowers like the US and China are mainly centered around things like energy, and then obviously having agreements with these countries allows for a better, free trade, free movement of goods or trade agreements between China, for China and the US, and that's a benefit to them. In terms of China specifically, we've seen over the years, and I mention China mainly because it also has communist background, and continues to do so, is that you are currently seeing a shift away from China in the past few years from Eastern European countries. The main reason for this is that China has still sided with Russia currently, and a lot of Eastern European countries don't want to side with Russia anymore because of the war, and they don't see it as being a major benefit to them, or they just disagree with what Russia is doing, considering that they've sort of gone through that history of being a part of the USSR and wanting independence. So you are currently seeing sort of the dissolving of economic agreements that have been between China and Eastern European countries. Example is the China and Central Asian and Eastern European countries agreement. That's China CEEC. So Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Czech Republic are examples of countries, and there's many more, that are no longer part of this agreement. I mean, at some point, I think it might have gotten up to close to 20 countries at a point of this agreement, and that number is substantially falling. Now, I'm mentioning the Eastern European countries that are still friends with China, and I'm mentioning Kazakhstan here. It is a Central Asian country, so it doesn't really fall into an Eastern European chat, but I don't know if you will ever get a content session on Central Asia. So I will mention it, is that you are seeing a lot of Central Asian countries that have a connection with China still. And I mean, it's mainly because they're still deciding that there are economic agreements that are worth having with China. Also, for these countries and some of the Eastern European countries that are choosing to still be associated with China, it's because they think that they get a larger defensive benefit from China than from NATO. So a lot of Eastern European countries that choose to side with the West, namely do so because they eventually want to join NATO at a point because they're worried about their closeness to Russia and potentially being invaded. The countries that don't either have some relation with Russia still, or they see a larger benefit, including a defensive benefit, from being signed with China. In terms of the Central Asian countries that are still aligned with China, I want to mention this because there's been some very interesting agreements here, namely Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan has not only signed an energy agreement with China, but they've also signed agreements to exchange private data and information with China, namely for migration policies and ethnic policies. So as you know, there's obviously China is quite anti-Muslim because it has its thing of like only Chinese people being in China, and obviously we know of things like the Muslim concentration camp or the Muslim camps that have been set up in China, and these are obviously an extreme problem. What is related to this is that Kazakhstan's deals that it's signed are allowing the exchange of private information of Turkish ethnic groups like the Uyghurian people who are Muslim, and exchanging that to China, but also policies that, even in Kazakhstan that has a substantial Muslim and Uyghurian population, has now signed an agreement with China that can lead to the future oppression of these individuals and degradation of human rights in these countries. So I would say in terms of the religion conversation we've had, it's important to note that in Central Asia, with the closeness to Eastern Europe, that we are seeing deals that are taking place that are leading to an oppression of ethnic groups and of religious groups. Again, not entirely related to the Eastern European conversation, but I think considering this as something that's very recently happened, it is worth doing after this an additional read up into Central Asia and its international agreements that it's formed. But that pretty much covers China and Eastern Europe. The main rundown here to note is that when it comes down to it, Eastern European countries are trying to break away from Russia. They're doing one of three things. They're either trying to join NATO and in the process probably have a lot of agreements with countries like the United States. They're either wanting to join the European Union, obviously because of its closeness and you get a lot of benefits out of that, and they're in Europe, or they're choosing to side with China. But this is becoming less of the case. Alongside not wanting to be affiliated with Russia anymore, but you're still seeing some Central Asian countries that want to join, that still want to have a connection with China. So this sort of gives you the rundown of where these Eastern European countries stand at the moment, and just sort of their overall connection. But I would say read up into a lot of countries because there are some very interesting individual agreements that exist. I think this covers everything, though, for post-fall of communism, so we're going to head over to our final topic to round this out, which is going to be Ukraine. So I'm going to hand back over to Joe.
Okay, so for understanding what is happening in Ukraine now, we really have to go back more than 100 years ago. We're going back to the Russian Empire, which was like one of the biggest empires in Europe. You can do your own research if you want to know more about it. It's actually quite interesting. However, what happened in the Russian Empire is that the Russian Empire comprised of different countries, different nationalities, different ethnicities. It was, as in any empire, it was not just one one group of people. There were different groups of people, including, for example, including Ukrainians that were living in the territory that we call now Ukraine, but they were also mixed with Russians. Like, it was not very, very clear. When the Bolshevik Revolution happened, so like in 1917, one thing that basically they kind of wanted to do that was different from the Russian Empire was this whole idea of right of self-determination. Because during the Russian Empire, those countries, those people that were in the empire, they didn't really have much of a choice than to listen to the emperor, to the Tsar. So when they basically killed the Tsar, after that, they kind of promised this right of self-determination that led to a lot of, for example, that led to what we call now Moldova, who used to be in the Russian Empire, to be able to join Romania for a few years. Then they took it back. Now it's its own country, but that also explains why Moldovans are basically a mix of Romanians and Russians, because that territory has been, passed from Russia and Romania for a long, long time. So what happened after the Bolshevik Revolution? Ukraine tried to establish as an independent state. However, that didn't really succeed too much because then USSR happened, and initially you had a lot of people from USSR who were put in positions of power in Ukraine, and then everything was kind of absorbed in USSR. That meant that USSR was very diverse in terms of ethnicities, of nationalities. Again, borders were not very, very clear. Another thing that is important about Ukraine for you to know is that it's a very, very diverse country. Apart from Ukrainians, there are a lot of Russians in the east part, a lot of Romanians. Myself, I'm from a region in Romania which is basically called Bukovina. Bukovina is a region that the southern part of it is in Romania and the northern part of it is in Ukraine. In my region, there are a lot of Ukrainian people. I also have Ukrainian roots, and a lot of Romanians live in Ukraine. So you see that borders here are not very clear. You have people of different nationalities living in different countries. And also a lot of Poles in the west, a lot of Tatars. Tatars are basically they're of Muslim origin. They're migratory population, let's say. They lived in Romania, they lived in Ukraine. They are very popular in Crimea, for example. We'll get there as well. But the whole point here is that Ukraine is very diverse. Ukraine under USSR suffered a lot. For example, they had a man-made famine called Holodomor, which was basically like the fault of Stalin. Anthony mentioned about the whole famine that happened throughout USSR. However, Ukrainians were really, really exposed to this. Sometimes it's even considered a genocide because a lot of them died, and it's considered that was, targeted as an ethnic cleansing. However, this is not something that everyone agrees on. They started to have this opinion more and more since the war, but before that, it was still very, very much disputed. Okay, so this was basically the background you guys need to know, and then we're jumping to 2014. What happened in 2014, apart from Crimea invasion, which is a bit more popular, is something that was before Crimea invasion, which was the language policies. So basically, around that time, Ukraine started to be very anti-Russian, tried to get themselves as, further from Russia as possible for, obvious reasons. We see that they don't have, the best relationship. However, one thing that Ukraine did, which is, to be fair, in a lot of ways questionable, were their language policies. I explained to you how Ukraine is very, very diverse. However, what they passed in 2014 was a law that basically prevented people from accessing education in any other language apart from Ukrainian. That including Romanian, that including Russian. So a lot of, native Russians, for example, in the east part, were not able anymore to study in Russian. And since there are so many Russians in Ukraine, that really created a wave of protests and, people who were not very happy about this. That also was linked to the Crimea invasion. Now, the Crimea invasion, it's a bit of a tricky thing in the sense that in Crimea there are a lot of Russians. Some of them wanted Crimea to be part of Russia. Some of the people living in Crimea didn't want to. A lot of the Tatars that I told you about, they've been persecuted under USSR, so they were not necessarily very happy with Russia. Opinions are very, very different here. However, the problem is that whatever Russia did was not considered by international law and by the international community as something lawful. So that is why we see the Crimea invasion as a problematic thing, because it was not in a democratic or in a lawful way done. Is there anything else you would add before we jump to the last thing with the current situation?
I would jump onto the language policies again, only because if you do any further reading into it, you'll say that this was a reason behind the invasion as well. Russia's mentioned this again quite recently, so you think that, these are only allegations that have come about, as a result of the invasion. And I would say no, exactly as you said, that this has been going on for a very long time.
Yeah.
So if you're reading into it, know that these are recurring allegations that have come across from Russia. And I will mention something else, but I'll mention it, I think the invasion point, it becomes more relevant there.
Yeah, because you again said something about the language policies. This is a problematic thing in the sense that most countries who face like different populations. So, for example, in Romania we have a lot of Hungarians, and in the region where we have a lot of Hungarians, they can access education. They can take their national exams in Hungarian. They can also have higher education like university in Hungarian. That is because if we wouldn't offer this education in Hungarian, they would be pretty upset and they would probably want to be their own state. So this is kind of the problem in Ukraine, and that's also like what led to both Crimea invasion and the Ukraine's invasion that is taking place now. So I'm gonna briefly talk about this. I think we don't necessarily have to explain the whole context because it's recent. Probably you've heard it. It's, you know, quite popular, I would say. But one thing that you have to keep in mind is that basically it looks like we have Russians in the east part of Ukraine, and Russia said, look, we're gonna protect those Russians. They don't want to be part of Ukraine. They want to be part of Russia. That's where Russians live. So they're supposed to belong to Russia. And they did this invasion. However, in the process of, taking that territory, there's been a lot of people killed. They've destroyed a lot of cities, and a lot of people were forced to migrate. I live really close to Ukraine, so I also had like the chance to do a lot of volunteering in the sense that I saw a lot of people coming for a few days in my city and then going to in different places. So I had the experience of being very close to this war. It's a problem that keep going on because, well, Ukraine seems to resist Russia's attack, and Russia probably just over-evaluated themselves, thinking that they're gonna that they're gonna win this really easy. But soon there's gonna be like 2 years since the invasion happened, and the situation is a bit unclear what's gonna happen from now on. I don't know if you have anything else to say. I was thinking of talking about the whole peace agreement and that discussion, if it would appear in a motion.
I think the peace agreement thing as well. Also that it's not incredibly, it's not like the most relevant to the Ukraine thing, but it's worth mentioning here what we've seen from the invasion as well is like understanding that sure, like Ukraine had an association with the USSR at a point. It has sort of a very close connection with Russia, where Russia sort of just sees as like, yeah, part of Ukrainian territory is sort of just Russian, and we view as being Russia. That's a sentiment not only expressed towards Ukrainian people, but also recognizing that there are a lot of different ethnic groups within Russia itself. And like we've seen this with a lot of like Eastern Europe, that like Eastern European countries themselves might find themselves affected by different cultures or different countries more because of how close they are. But also in Russia, we've seen that there are a lot of smaller ethnic groups that exist in provinces or in communities or areas throughout Russia. And from the invasion, they've also become a lot more outspoken, a lot more aggressive, trying to resist a lot more because, well, one, they've seen, I wouldn't call it a success of Ukraine, but a resistance from Ukraine that was unexpected, but also sort of pointing out that, hey, this idea of Russia, or the sentiment from Russia that says like you are just Russian because you've a closeness to us or you have a history with us. A lot of states are saying like no, that's not the case anymore. Obviously, I think it is a more complex issue considering that at the same time there are Russian people living in Ukraine and that they've built their livelihoods there. So it's not a conversation of saying Ukraine is completely absolved of everything. It is to say that the idea of invasion is a terrible one and should never have happened, but it does lead into a very difficult conversation then on what we can talk about now, which is peace agreements.
Yeah. So with the peace agreements, and I think this is very likely, like you might see this in a motion. It really depends from which perspective are we talking about. Like if we have an agent motion and the agent is Ukraine, one thing that you should know about Ukraine views on the war right now and Zelensky, like their president view, is that it's everything or nothing for them, in the sense that they're not willing to give a part of their territory to achieve peace. This is something that they made very clear. We know a lot of Ukrainian people, they have a very patriotic sense right now, and they're very willing to fight to basically have what it's their own territory. However, from a more general perspective or from the perspective of other actors like, I don't know, international community, United States, you name it, there are discussions about what would be the most, effective way to end the war, which is sometimes considered a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine in which both of them should, make compromises. The compromise from Ukraine being its east region that was, attacked initially. Um, Now, obviously, you bring your own arguments in the debate. We're not here to provide that, but this is kind of like the framing and the values that you should keep in mind whenever we're talking about the peace agreement. From an external position, yeah, it's a bit, you can see pros and cons, but from Ukraine's position, it's a very clear stance of we're fighting. We want to get what is ours, and yeah, we're not gonna compromise to Russia.
Yeah. And then on top of that, when we talk about countries that aren't Ukraine, then still keep the Ukraine in perspective, because it becomes like a bit difficult then in certain motions where it's like a country that's not Ukraine trying to vie for peace. Ukraine's just going to keep saying, if it involves giving up territory, that's not going to happen. So then the outcome becomes very, very hazy for the future. I'd say if you ever get a motion where you're thinking of an actor that could intervene in some way, you've probably already been told this a lot by your coaches. Please don't say the United Nations. Please don't say the United Nations is going to send in an army to deal with the problem. The United Nations has a peacekeeping force, which it sometimes sends in, but never into a war situation. These are individuals who make sure that, any sort of charity groups that come in to provide aid are protected or something like that. Note, as of currently, the only foreign military support that is being provided to Ukraine is a volunteer army, right? No country is going to send their own troops in, and that is because of, obviously, the fact that Russia is a very large country and superpower, and any sort of tensions with them is not really supported. But also in our current day and age, and what has made the Russian-Ukrainian situation so severe and unexpected is that the idea of, we are currently moving away from the sort of classic invasion of sending in our troops to sort of take over a territory. It happens at much smaller scales. I mean, we obviously have what's happening with Israel-Palestine. We obviously have what happens in a lot of countries where you have small, like, attempted coups or small, what is the term I'm looking for, like small military groups, etc., or militant groups. That sort of thing happens. In terms of other countries' positions on it, obviously, the UN, the EU, a lot of countries have condemned Russia's involvement, like Russia's thing of the war. They're currently pushing for a peace agreement and all of those things. Is there ever going to be a point in time where a nation becomes involved to the point that they send in their military? I find that highly unlikely. Further, what countries have currently been doing that has continued for a long period of time has been obviously the provision of financial aid and military resources. Financial aid is not as consistent as it has been for the last in the last few months as it has been for like the last year or so. Military support, I mean, in terms of the provision of military resources, it's been quite consistent. The largest provider has obviously been the US. The reason for this is the United States has a stockpile of weapons in their cabinet that they need to get rid of. And this is a great way to do so. Also, I mean, you might come up with your things on like, oh, Hunter Biden, and, he's making money out of this, and the Biden family really enjoys this. Sure, you could come in with all of that, but I mean, from the most objective standpoint, the US has a lot of military resources that they don't need, and considering that even their most like 10-year outdated military resources are extremely capable and have proven extremely effective in the war for Ukrainian soldiers, does say something. As to how far we expect that aid to happen, we don't know, and currently we are in a stalemate period. So as of July, really, reports that we're receiving from Russia, Ukraine have become a bit more minimal. This is one, due to the fact that in your mainstream news and media, you're not hearing a lot about it, which says something, I think, about our political climate, in terms of the fact that it's just not being publicized as much as it could be because of other recent events that are happening. But I also think I also just think it's relevant from the point of the fact that we don't know what's going to happen next. I'd say the point we are now is at the most uncertain point as to what the conclusion of the war will be. In terms of a Russia-Ukraine motion that you might get, I don't think it could be something as direct as a peace agreement. I would say it would be unfortunate if you did get something like that, because it is a far too like a far too complex thing to get emotion about as simple as a peace agreement. Hopefully you get something a little bit more specific about a certain country's approach to a problem or how a certain country should deal with things in a certain way. But I think in terms of how to deal with it from a debate perspective, that would be the only additional things I would add. Any final points before we wrap up?
Yeah, like I remembered something when you mentioned military intervention, which was about Article 5 of NATO protocol. Basically, what that says is the fact that if any country that is part of NATO is attacked, then all the countries who are part of NATO are like obliged to intervene and help that country. What happened? It was a situation in which there was a missile that got into Poland territory, and then it was later discovered it was a Ukrainian one, so it was not a Russian one. But the news were like, "Oh, World War III!" You know, everyone panicked because indeed, if like Poland or the Baltics or Romania, states who are like next to Ukraine, would actually be targeted and something would happen with them, then that's the moment that NATO might intervene. And when NATO intervenes, it does get a bit messy because that does look a bit more like World War III. However, it's not the case, and I also think like Russia is very, very precautious with this because I don't think they are not in a position in which they risk to bring NATO into discussion. Yeah. So yeah, that was the only thing.
Yeah, I think absolutely. To keep in mind the fact that Ukraine is currently trying to join NATO. It is being blocked. I think Hungary is blocking it, but like a lot of other nations are blocking it. And the reason being directly what Joe said, that countries don't want a wider scale war. If Ukraine were to join, it would mean that they would have to be militarily involved, and that is just not in the interests of some countries. You can argue from an ethical point of view whether or not that be the case, but I mean, objectively, for a country to willingly sign itself into a war and obviously put its soldiers on the like actual physical soldiers on the line is a very difficult thing for it to willingly choose to do. But yeah, it's to keep in mind that Ukraine is currently trying to join NATO. Keep in mind that they try to do this, I think since 2010 or 2014 they've been trying to join, but this has been blocked for numerous reasons. At the start, I think it was for political reasons because NATO wasn't happy with the government elections that had taken place at the time. But since then, it's obviously because of the war. Do I personally think, or do either of us personally think that it will join NATO anytime soon? Probably not, but it becomes difficult to say.
Also, the thing with Ukraine is that it's literally the border between the West and Russia.
Yeah.
That's why it's like Ukraine also likes to praise themselves as we really help the West to protect you guys from Russia. Now this also comes problematic because the second Ukraine is in NATO, that's a very long border between NATO and Russia. We saw that, for example, Finland and Sweden joined NATO recently. They were not part of NATO exactly because they were bordering Russia, so they wanted to avoid any conflict, but they decided to do that now for security reasons.
Yeah. Like the most strategic reason for Ukraine being an independent state that is not affiliated with NATO or anything else is that it serves as a buffer zone. In some ways, you could say similar to how North Korea serves as a buffer zone for countries like China and stuff like that. Ukraine's obviously far, far different from any of that. But it does literally serve as a buffer zone. So as long as it is supported and countries are willing to provide military aid, that's a fine concession for them up to this point in time. But to go to the point of then going from we have a buffer zone that between us and Russia, and we are now actively involved in combating Russia, are very different situations for countries to be involved in. So if you might get emotion about NATO's accession, whether or not that should take place. Keep in mind all of these factors. I don't think there's anything else worth mentioning here. So with that, I'll say thank you very much for listening to us speak for what has probably been close to an hour now. Our apologies in advance for that.
Probably more.
Probably more. We didn't mean to take this much time. If there are still any questions you have after this, Corwin does have my number. Ask him for it. You can directly message me, and then Joe and I can help you with any extra questions that you have. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.